Hello, hello. This is Space Cafe Podcast, and I am Marcus. They say space smells like burnt steak. Seriously, this episode goes out to the super nerds among you. The super nerds who always wanted to know why spaceships look so boring and anything but science fiction. The super nerds who are dying to know how to make coffee on the ISS. What's up with the weird moon that has mountains of plastic and kerosene? And if and when we start heading towards Alpha Centauri. My guest today is a lot of fun.
There is actually the astronaut training version of the Soyuz flight computer software is available for download from a somewhat dodgy seeming Russian website, which I found. And it's completely in Russian. So I asked a friend of mine, a colleague from Kazakhstan, to translate it for me. And I managed to navigate around and I knew how to use it. And then in the simulator, I just knew what I was doing.
First of all, he lives in the forest in Finland. And every now and then, he jumps into a hole in the frozen lake in front of his cottage. And of course, he's a plasma physicist during the day. During the night, his world looks different. Welcome, Urs Ganse, to our cozy little place. Let's go.
Okay, hi, I'm Urs Ganse. I'm a space physicist working at the University of Helsinki, and I'm doing large space plasma simulations of near-Earth space using supercomputers. Basically, the biggest computers in Europe have been made to sweat by the simulations I'm running and developing. But apart from that, I think I gained a little bit of notoriety in the German-speaking part of the space YouTube channels, at least, because I, a couple of years ago, started giving some public outreach talks just about space topics, and it started with one about how to fly spaceships, which was basically just a
because you're an astronaut, of course.
I tried, I applied, but they didn't want me. No, but all I've done was play Kerbal Space Program, and I've been watching and reading and so on ever since I was a kid. So I just knew a lot. I can't even trace back specifically where I got most of my space knowledge from, but I just happen to know a bunch of things. And then I gave another lecture on how to build spacecraft about mostly I'm concentrating on the stuff that other people don't concentrate on, like the boring details. What is the material of the outer hull of a spaceship? What is the shape of the re-entry body? And then I, 2 years ago on Christmas at the CCC Congress, I gave a talk about the spacecraft life support systems and what are the chemicals you need in a life support system and so on.
So that's the Chaos Computer Club?
Yeah, they are. There's a yearly conference organized by them.
A nerd gathering, right?
All of my talks have been at nerd gatherings because I don't feel comfortable really talking about this in a professional context because, as I said, I just gathered random knowledge. But then I thought, I go to a nerd conference and these people care about computers and care about technology, and I know maybe a little bit more. And so I talked to them about that. And then that also what got recorded and put on YouTube and became apparently quite late in the German-speaking YouTube world. And then this most recent talk about life support systems, I've also given in English, so that's available. Apart from these talks about spaceships and how to build them, how to fly them, how to survive in them, my day job is really plasma physics and Earth radiation belts, the magnetosphere, and since I'm working in Finland in the University of Helsinki, also northern lights and how they are created, what are the processes that cause them and what are the processes that prevent them. So.
Fascinating. So you have the real world, like the plasma physics scientific world, and then your nighttime world when you play Kerbal Space Program, teach yourself how to fly a spaceship, and maybe build a spaceship. Is that about right?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. And even though these are marginally related, I can only officially claim that I'm proficient in my daytime job. It's just that the YouTube credits say that I'm more famous in the other one.
Tell us, was to give us a foundation for your expertise, what brings you to Finland in the first place?
Well, I did a PhD I studied physics and did my PhD in the University of Würzburg in Germany in space plasma physics. And then I was looking for a job. I applied at the European Space Agency and then applied at a couple of universities in Germany and so on, but nothing came from it. And then suddenly I got an email from the University of Helsinki, who had heard that I just graduated, saying that, do you want to come with us, work on interplanetary shock physics? We have some money to burn. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? And that's how I came to Finland. And at that point, I didn't really know yet that the Finnish space research has always been specifically focused on Northern Lights for obvious reasons, but actually that a lot of spacecraft instrumentation of probes flying to other planets that deal with the upper atmosphere has been built in Finland. There are now already 5 different air pressure sensors on different spacecraft by NASA and by ESA that have landed or crashed on Mars, built in Finland. Then there is a number of particle instruments on SOHO and on Ulysses spacecraft that have been built in the University of Turku. And so there's actually quite vibrant space instrumentation
community,
scientific
industry.
Background community in Finland.
Interesting.
Even though Finland is not maybe the first country that you think of when you're thinking of spaceflight. Particularly since there's still not been a single Finn in space. It's one of these countries that does not have a single astronaut in space.
But doesn't Santa Claus come from Finland?
Yeah, but technically he travels in the troposphere. I think it's not space.
What our audience cannot see, and this is now not related to anything we're talking about, you are in a wooden shack. It seems like you're in a sauna. And the interesting thing is we already had a guest here on this podcast from Finland. He was also in a sauna. So my question is, what is going on in Finland with your saunas? And why are you doing interviews or podcasts from saunas?
Well, this is Finland. I'm actually 3 hours north of Helsinki, in the countryside, actually 25 kilometers away from any nearest civilization, because I've just, in the last 2 years, been evading the pandemic by just sitting in the forest in a log cabin. And then if you are sitting by a lake with a log cabin, you don't have running water, but you have a sauna. So instead of going for a shower, you heat up the sauna and then you jump in the lake. Also, right, last week it was -20 and we have a hole in the ice and then jump in the lake. And that's how you do the bathing.
Thanks for clarifying that. Wonderful. Urs, you collected more than 1 million views for one of your lectures you gave about how to build a spacecraft. Mm-hmm. So was this planned from your end, this success?
No, as I said, I just wanted to give this as a presentation at a nerd event. The venue where I held this is called the Gulasch Programming Night in Karlsruhe, Germany, which is even weirder than the CCC Congress because it's about programming computers and cooking goulash, because they claim that cooking is like programming for hungry people. And so they also always had a space track. There have been talks about different engines and spacecraft designs. And I just decided there to, as I said in the beginning, do talk about the tiny little details that other people leave out in how to build a spacecraft hull. Like really only focusing on the outer part of the hull. How do you build it? How do you make it resistant to micrometeoroid impacts? How do you make it airtight? How do you keep it from becoming less airtight when it heats up and cools down? And then I just focused on all these details and told it in such a way that my final conclusion was that basically the design requirements are the same as for a can of pea soup. And
seriously,
it needs to have the same requirements. It needs to be airtight so that in a pea soup, you don't want it to smell. In a spacecraft, you don't want the air to come out. You want it to be light, you want it to be pressure stable, and so on. And then I compared the pea soup can to the design of the first Mercury capsules, and they do look kind of similar, I have to say. and then how it evolved from there, and how things are actually nowadays much more advanced than that. But it was a just a funny talk I gave in front of a couple of nerds, and they put it on YouTube, and it spread like wildfire through the internet.
Fascinating. And then you got asked at some point to write a book about those things?
Yeah,
right?
a big German science publishing company, who I maybe not name, asked me to just, can you put that in the book? And I was a little bit stunned because it was a 1.5 hour talk. How can I fill a book with that? But then I got a little bit help from my sister, who happens to be a space medicine expert, and we wrote it together. And we call it the Spacefarer's Handbook, and it contains all that. It contains basics of orbital navigation. It contains spacecraft design, construction principles, and then everyday life in space, and how to stay healthy, how to not lose your bone and muscle mass, and then it became a proper book. So if you Google my name and the Spacefarer's Handbook, you can find it.
Spacefarer's Handbook, wonderful. Urs, why is it still, and maybe the exception is the Dragon capsule, but why is it still that spacecraft look so utterly boring? I mean, like they don't look anything like what Hollywood has been showing us for almost 50 years now. And I have the feeling that the Dragon capsule goes in the right direction, but what is it? Why are there no like shiny looking spacecraft around?
Because shiny isn't really good. You don't want shiny. Let's start from the beginning. The thing that Hollywood wants to show us is either something that looks like a fighter jet in space, which is not really realistic because you don't need wings. Why would you want wings on a spacecraft? Yes. Most of the time you just hang out in space and don't care about your shape.
Laser guns, that's what you need wings for.
Exactly. It gives you good pew, pew, pew. Yeah. But in real life, we are not constrained by our pew, 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 but we are constrained by how much do we get up and down through the atmosphere. That's really the design limitation of spacecraft nowadays. We want to lift as much mass as possible through this pesky gravitational well that we are sitting in, and to this thick soup-like atmosphere. And then once we're up, we really don't care what it looks like. That's why the ISS much more looks like a spacecraft as science fiction shows us, because we just slap random chunks together and all the technology is poking out in all directions, because why wouldn't it? And then when you want to come down again, you again need to deal with this nasty atmosphere, and everything that pokes out will melt off. So that's why basically the parts that then come down are always teardrop shaped, more or less. More in the case of capsules like the Soyuz and the Dragon, and less so when you have a space plane. But a space plane like the space shuttle then comes with its own problems, as the space shuttle program proved when we lost a couple of them.
Let's go back into outer space. Let's go back to the ISS. Still, I think the ISS looks, it's an old piece of hardware already, and it's almost outdated. But still, if you take a look at the inside, why are there no panels covering those walls?
So why is it not sleek and fancy? You mean?
Why is it not just like in the science fiction movies?
No, well, you have to consider that the ISS primarily is a research item. It's basically mankind's, let's say, 2.5 attempt at building a space station that sustains itself. The first one was Skylab on the US side, and the Soyuz stations on the Soviet side. The second one then was Mir, which was already a little bit of an evolved concept. And this is only really the third generation of space station that we are building. And there's still a lot we haven't figured out and are still in the process of figuring out. That's why it looks like it's been bolted together from little pieces of wood and snot to just barely keep it flying, because that's basically what it is. There are a lot of technologies that you can hardly develop on Earth, and you just need to put them in a space station to see how they develop, and then they break down and you need to fix them in place. A good example, for example, is the toilet. When the ISS was first launched, the Americans built one toilet, which was based on the space shuttle toilet design, which worked really well for 2 months and then broke down. The Russians built another toilet that was based on the Soyuz design, which is a really, really simple, well, you know what the stereotypes say about Russian design. They built it simple and built it solid. And that has been working ever since, to the point that the Americans then also bought that same toilet from the Russians and put it on the American side of the station. So there are two, or were now for the longest time, only two Russian toilets for 20 years. Now the Americans, with lots of effort for the Artemis program, designed an entirely new toilet, new principles designed for the Lunar Gateway Station to test it on the ISS. And they put it up and they put it in and it ran for 2 months and then it broke down. So we are again in the state that the only long-term working toilets in space are the Russian ones. And the same principle is true for almost everything on the ISS, that there are competing designs. You put them up there, you let them run for a while and see how they fail and when they fail, and then you iterate the design. Which means that everything on the ISS breaks down sooner or later, and it needs to be serviceable, and it needs to be removable, and that you can't easily do behind nice, sleek covers, but the technology just shows. It's similar to, if you look at a car from the 50s in the engine, all the technology is exposed. And if you look at a car now, you open the hood and all you see is plastic covers. In the same way, with space station designs, we're currently in the state of the 50s because everything keeps breaking down and you need to just fix it all the time. And so you can't just make it look so sleek.
That makes
the Dragon capsule. Yeah. The Dragon capsule is then the obvious example of the modernization of that, because after 50 years of flying the Soyuz capsule, we now know how to build a working and nice capsule that just survives in space for a couple of days and then comes down again. So the Soyuz capsule is that a little bit more user-friendly and nothing more.
Can you?
As soon as we want to fly something to Mars, we again have to start with very different technologies, because again, everything needs to be user-serviceable.
Speaking of surviving in space, could you give us a little bit of an insight into what space is all about and why it is so difficult to do anything out there? Speaking of radiation, speaking of the vacuum, so what is space like?
Well, there are different things there. If you just want, as a human being, to survive in space, you are immediately lacking a couple of things. I mean, you need to breathe air, obviously, but that's not enough. If you do it just to pop out into the vacuum of space with a breathing bottle on your back with a rebreather, you would still immediately die because there's low pressure. It's not enough to pump oxygen in your lungs. You need to have pressure around you, otherwise all the fluids in your body boil, because they're surrounded by zero pressure. Everything just bubbles like a mineral water bottle that you're just opening. So you need to have pressure and air. And then you have the problem that you're also breathing out CO2. On Earth, the CO2 you're breathing out just gets absorbed by the nearest plant and then gets recycled. And if you're not taking care of that in your spaceship, your CO2 accumulates and quickly poisons you. So you need to have a mechanism to recycle that.
That was the issue on the Apollo mission, right?
Right. In Apollo 13, where they had a power failure in the command module, nothing was powering the CO2 recyclers. So they were just using the ones from the lunar lander. But that wasn't built for 3 people and 5 days. That was built for 2 people and 2 days.
They had to improvise.
So it's saturated. Yeah. But that's just the life support system. There are other issues in space that you're probably not thinking about beforehand. For example, if you're in a vacuum, if you're sitting nicely and cozily in your spacecraft and all your life support system work well, and your spacecraft has a metal hull, so it's outside, just for example, aluminium, and on Earth, if you have a piece of aluminium and you touch another piece of aluminium with it, what happens is that they clonk together and nothing happens. In a vacuum of space, if you have 2 pieces of metal and you clonk them together, there's no air between these 2 pieces of metal. So what happens is, as soon as the crystal structure of the one metal gets in contact with the crystal structure of the other metal, they form a crystal bond, and these pieces of metal will never, ever separate again. They are as if they had been one. That's called vacuum friction welding, and it is a really, really big problem to have any moving parts in a vacuum. Because on Earth, the surface of aluminium is immediately coated by an oxide layer, and then it becomes slippery. It doesn't in space. So anything that moves in a vacuum, if you don't make sure that all the surfaces are lubricated with Teflon or some materials, every metal that moves against a metal will immediately stick and become one piece of metal that never separates. And the ISS, for example, has the big solar arrays that are turning and tilting and following the sun for optimum sunlight. And the first 10 years or so of the station, there were countless spacewalks trying to figure out why the rotary joints of that solar panel assembly was always getting stuck, because they were friction welding themselves together, and then they had to be replaced and replaced and replaced. They finally gotten around and designed a version that no longer friction welds. But even after millions of dollars of development, they had the problem with the friction welding in that. And the list goes on, because all kinds of material properties are different when you don't have air around you. You have problems with heat and cold, because if you're out in space has this background temperature of 2 Kelvin, so it's almost at the absolute 0 point. So it's very cold.
What is that in Celsius?
That's minus 271. But you're in a vacuum, so you're perfectly insulated. You're like in the best thermos bottle. So if you create any heat in your spacecraft, that doesn't go away. And then you're also in the sunlight, and the sun pumps a kilowatt per square meter into your spacecraft, because that's just what the sun radiates into you. So you have the problem that on one side your spacecraft heats up tremendously and nothing gets the heat away, and on the other side it cools down. And if you're not taking care of that, you will get thermal stress in your hull material, in your structure, and then something that was airtight before might get cracks. The easy solution to that is, of course, to always rotate everything. The Apollo navigation computer had a program called the barbecue roll, which just kept the spacecraft rotating slowly along its long axis. Or you need to do, as the ISS does, pump actually coolant around the outer hull all the time, which is one of the big safety threats on the ISS, because it's using liquid ammonia, and if that were to leak into the station, the official guidelines say that it needs to be abandoned forever, because they can no longer clean it such that it's safe for habitation.
You know what? I find that utterly interesting, because there are so many variables that need to be taken into consideration when it comes to leaving the planet and going into this new medium or this new place. Because if you compare that to Earth and you go back to when humans spread around the planet and discovered new places, this is still the same Earth. So gravity and radiation and temperature is pretty much the same wherever you go on Earth. Not speaking of the poles, of course. But if you go into space, so on Earth you can anticipate, you can bring warmer clothes or whatnot. But if you go into space, there's completely different rules. So my question is, how is it possible to anticipate every little detail? Because if you miss one detail, the mission will fail. So how is that possible in the first place?
You don't. You can't, and you don't. And that's why the ISS looks like it does. You just need to live with the problems until you find solutions for it. And it can be something as simple as, how do you cook coffee in zero gravity? There's been coffee on the ISS since the start, but nobody could cook it, because for normal coffee, if you want to make a filter coffee, you need gravity to pull your coffee through the filter. And that didn't work. So
you'd have to twist it.
Exactly. The so-called Expedition 7 method, ISS Expedition 7 invented that. You put it in a cup and you put it in a sock and you spin the sock around, and that's how you made coffee. Until about 5 years ago, where the first Italian astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti, first Italian woman in space, she bought a espresso machine along to the ISS.
Because put it into the sock and then twisted it.
Well, the espresso machine works with pressure. It doesn't need gravity. They finally stopped spinning socks around to make coffee. But it's all kinds of these small problems and small solutions that you just need to gain experience with. And we're hardly done with that, because now we have space stations in low Earth orbit. If you look at a map of space, any sort of map of space, the ISS is only maybe 300 kilometers above you. There are much further places on Earth from civilization.
Yes.
If you're in the middle of the Pacific, you're further away from civilization than the ISS. You're really in low Earth orbit. You're just barely outside. As soon as we start putting space stations anywhere else, we'll encounter new problems. Because, for example, no human being has been outside of Earth's magnetosphere for longer than 2 days. The people that landed on the moon have been outside of Earth's magnetic field, but all of them got lucky and were there in low radiation environments for pure coincidence. So we absolutely have zero data points about what happens to humans when they're exposed to cosmic radiation for longer than a day. Because nobody has tried. We don't really know. We don't know how to shield it effectively. And this is also nothing we can even test on Earth, because there are plenty of data points from radiation poisoning on Earth, from nuclear reactors, from all kinds of incidents. But the radiation from a nuclear reactor, that's in the mega electron volt range, behaves very differently in human tissue than cosmic rays in giga and tera electron volt range. And it's unknown what they do, and it's unknown what they do in long duration. And this will be very interesting to find out. And it probably will have, at the start, some really unfortunate results for the people who try, because it can't be expected that this will result in nice effects on the human body.
So the further you go out into space, the more violent this environment gets. I mean, like we've heard a couple of years ago that the Voyager probes left the solar system officially and left the heliopause, a shielding place from the cosmic radiation. And now they are going into a completely new medium, whatever that is, where new rules are applied and where perhaps even more violent radiation is happening. Is that about right? That we are the deeper we go into deep space, the more violent it gets?
Yeah, and this is now finally where we connect to my actually everyday work, because right now we are here when we're sitting on Earth, we're in an atmosphere, in a magnetic field that shields us, so we are basically not experiencing any charged particles around us, unless there's a reactor incident. We don't experience any charged particles. As soon as you go out into space, you have a little bit of them, but as it turns out on the ISS, that's an okay dose. They're measuring it, they're measuring the effects. It's not a big problem. Once you go outside of Earth's magnetosphere, you're suddenly exposed to the charged particles of the solar wind. So the sun radiates not just light, but all kinds of high energy particles, and you need to deal with them. Then when you go even further out, like the Voyager probes, once you leave the area that's dominated by the solar wind, where the solar wind is the primary pressure source, you're in the interstellar medium, and what you're then dealing with is basically unfiltered radiation from supernova explosions and quasars and all that hits you, and that's even higher energies. But realistically, I don't believe that humans will leave the solar system anytime soon, because the next logical thing then to go to would be Alpha Centauri, and you would have to travel for a couple of light years. Before that, when we go further away, even when then there's not a big difference if we go to the moon or if we go to an asteroid or if we go to the moon of Saturn, for example. Jupiter is not a good place to go, by the way. If you think of what Earth's magnetic field does with the radiation that comes in, you've probably seen these pictures of the field lines that look like a dipole, and then all the radiation ends up at the poles, and they cause northern lights here in Finland, which means the radiation just goes to the poles and falls into the atmosphere there. In Jupiter, the magnetic field is much, much stronger, and it just traps the particles in these radiation belts that are so strong that probably even crossing them would be lethal to humans. So you probably cannot fly a spacecraft to any of the Jovian moons without killing the crew. In Saturn, the same is true. In Saturn, you have the same strong magnetic field, you have the same radiation belts that trap particles, and then you have the rings, and the rings just absorb that radiation. So Saturn's rings soak it all away, and it's basically a completely radiation-quiet environment. So that's, even though Saturn is further away, it's probably a much nicer target to go to for human exploration.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned going to Alpha Centauri. I once read that at the current speed of our fastest spaceships, it would take about 70 to 80,000 years to get there. Is that about right?
If you take currently the fastest traveling object that mankind has produced is the New Horizons probe, and that took 12 years, I think, to fly to Pluto, and then it just would have to keep going. Yeah. So at the current spacecraft technologies, propulsion technologies, you wouldn't. I don't know the numbers by heart, but 80,000 years sounds realistic. You can't just get anywhere reasonably with chemical propulsion or ion drives that we have. Even if you had a perfect, like, let's say, an antimatter annihilation drive, where you convert most of your mass directly into thrust, you still have the problem that it's 4 light years, and you need to accelerate first half the way and then slow down half the other way. So you'll be traveling for at least, I don't know, maybe 10 years, and then, even at the maximum physical possible acceleration.
And then you learn, once you arrive there, that no one's around and that Alpha Centauri is just a boring place.
It is a kind of bad place for human habitation also, because it's a smaller star, or it's a multi-star system, so the orbits are not as stable. So the planets probably don't, even if they're in a habitable zone, probably haven't been there long enough for any sort of equilibria in the atmospheres to form. And then at least one of the stars in this multi-system is also quite flary, much more flary than our sun. It's basically bubbling and throwing out mass all the time. And that would probably strip most of the atmosphere from the planets if there are any. So there's probably no good reason to be there.
Not yet. What's your guess on the far future of humanity? Do you think that we'll ever become not an interplanetary, but an interstellar species? Star Trek, Enterprise kind of space travel?
I would say probably yes, but not in the way that Star Trek portrays it. Because I personally don't think that faster than light travel is something that's easily obtainable, even though, you might always be wrong. There might always be something that suddenly enables it, and then we hyper jump from system to system. What I think is more likely is that first, the shape of mankind itself will change a lot. As soon as you start to decouple our consciousness from our physical existence, I mean, be it that you upload yourself to a computer, or be it that you somehow manage to simulate the brain, or whatever it is, or transfer it from one body to the next, then people will just go, and then it doesn't matter if it takes 80,000 years. Then you'll just end up there eventually. But then it's also not the same as in Star Trek or in any other science fiction, because you leave, and if you ever come back, it will be so much time past that the mankind you're coming back to is anyway not the same you left. So why would you ever come back?
Right.
And then we would be living more like, I don't know, fungal spores. Since I'm here in the forest in Finland, and there are lots of mushrooms here, I wonder, there's a mushroom coming up, and then it keeps boring through the ground, and some other mushrooms at some other time emerge, and they have nothing to do with that original mushroom anymore. And it's probably going to be like that if we are going to be interplanetary or interstellar. The humans that built a colony on, I don't know, Gliese 581 is probably not going to have anything to do with the humans that remain on Earth.
Right. Wonderful. Let's go a little closer to our presence. Do you think there's any interesting thruster systems, new engines, new propellants on the horizon in the near future?
Well, I already said that you can't really get anywhere nice with chemical propellants. I mean, it's as if you wanted. Yeah, it's like running on steam engines. We've not evolved from there, but there are options. I mean, ion drives are very commonly nowadays used for station keeping of satellites. Like, you just, instead of burning things in a combustion chamber to have hot gases flow out, you accelerate particles with electromagnetic fields close to the speed of light. It's much more efficient, but your problem is the energy source. As long as you are using solar energy for that, you just are very limited, and it's not useful for human spaceflight because everything takes forever. It's nice to keep a satellite in place. It's nice to even fly something to the moon or so, but it's not practical for anything beyond that at the moment. The next logical step there is to build a fusion drive. Like you take a fusion reactor that does, for example, fusion of boron nuclei or anything that gives a positive energy output, and you just let your fusion products fly out at almost the speed of light. It doesn't even have to be a good fusion reactor, and that's something that a lot of people are always criticizing, that we haven't even managed a fusion reactor on Earth. Why would we manage to do one in space?
We have seen one now, like a couple of weeks ago, like stable for, I don't know, 15 seconds that was?
That's on Earth, you really needed to be stable. You needed to run for hundreds of seconds to produce positive energy. You don't really care about that, though, if you want it as a thruster. All you wanted is to do some fusion, and then you let that eject. If you're talking about the typical ring-shaped tokamak design, you basically could put that in arbitrarily bad fusion reactor on a spacecraft, and the diverter at the bottom, you just let it open to space, and you have a fusion thruster that's already more efficient than any ion drive you've built.
Just leave the door open.
Basically, you just leave the door, the diverter exhaust open to space, and you have a very nice fusion thruster. And that's something that just nobody so far has dared to build, and it also comes with the logistical problems of its own, because you still need some sort of shielding and so on. But that's a logical next step to do, because the fuel materials are then much easier to gather on other planets or mined from asteroids and so on. And if you have a rocket at the moment that runs on kerosene, you will be hard pressed to find kerosene anywhere else in the solar system except on Titan.
Why is there kerosene on Titan?
For whatever reason, the surface of Titan consists mostly of hydrocarbons. So if you remember a couple of years ago when the Cassini-Huygens probe landed on Titan, you saw these pictures of rocks and ice and so on. Turns out that wasn't rocks and ice. The thing that looks like rock is mostly solid water, and the thing that's water is mostly ethanol and propanol, so very similar to solvents.
So you have your fuel station moon.
And the thing that looks like mountains in the background, spectroscopically was determined to be mostly polyethylene, so plastic. For whatever reason, the surface of Titan is very much hydrocarbon chemistry as we know it on Earth. There's very little oxygen there to let this stuff burn, but there's all the other things there. So you can then, in principle, get something very much like kerosene from there.
Fascinating. So that would be your obvious refueling station for interplanetary missions.
Maybe yes, because you also have the Saturn rings there that are a good source of ice, and ice gives you oxygen, so you can maybe do that there. But now, of course, we're again talking about the far future and what infrastructure do you need to get both of these things together.
We have one more propellant, and that is the fuel-less propulsion of solar wind. So how about those solar sails?
Yeah, that's something that people have also been, science fiction has been talking about it since the 50s. Why do you need propellant at all for a spacecraft? Why don't you just unfurl a big foil and reflect sunlight? Which people have tried. There have been many attempts to build spacecraft like that. And as I said in the beginning, metal surfaces in vacuum are problematic. So most of these attempts at unrolling aluminium foil failed because it fused together. But there have now been some successful solar wind spacecraft, solar sail spacecraft. And then a couple of years ago, one of my colleagues from the Finnish Meteorological Institute, Pekka Janhunen, came up with the idea. He thought the sun produces lots of energy in the sunlight, so the photons that you reflect in the solar winds in a solar light sail. But actually, the light doesn't carry a lot of momentum; it just carries energy. The thing that carries a lot more momentum are the protons and alpha particles in the solar wind. So why don't we reflect them instead? So instead of building an aluminium foil and reflecting the light, what you can do is you take a surface and charge it up positively to maybe 4 million volt. And it doesn't even have to be a solid surface. You can just take a spacecraft, have a couple of wires, maybe 100 meters or kilometer long wires sticking out, rotate the spacecraft so that they remain tight, and then charge that whole thing up to 4 million volts, and you reflect the protons, and you get a much more efficient solar wind sail at much less mass, because these wires can be flimsy, they can be sub-micron size. And that's a prototype of that is now being flown. It's the same project that I'm being paid from, is the Finnish Center of Excellence for Research in Sustainable Space. And we are testing this in a spacecraft, again in low Earth orbit, to see if it works as calculated. And so that's one possible way to make space travel more efficient. The advantage of in this so-called electric sail is also that you can steer it, because you can simply change the charge on your wires and just turn it and move back and forth with it. So that's an interesting new development, because then you're no longer limited by propellant, and you can you can fly around much longer. It will probably also at first be very flimsy in its thrust and comparable to iron thrusters, but that's where we're going.
Fascinating. But I mean, like all the technologies you just mentioned, they work beyond Earth, beyond the confines of Earth, because a solar sail won't work on Earth. A fusion engine won't work on Earth, I guess. So,
right?
Is that about right?
That's true. The both iron engines and fusion engines probably don't fare very well in an atmosphere.
So what is it? What those science fiction spaceships use when they like land on a planet? Those vibrating blue shiny things, the Matrix ships had underneath them. What is it they're employing? Is this some kind of science fiction, or is it already in the direction of science fact?
You can also in an atmosphere, of course, use ions, and there are these so-called ion wind thrusters. You can actually build that yourself. They're like really dangerous homemade contraptions of that. You take a couple of wires, suspend them at a distance of a couple centimeters, and charge the top ones to 1,000,000 volt over the bottom ones, and random ionization of air molecules accelerates them down, and that produces thrust.
Wow.
So that works. The problem is then you have something that is almost throwing lightning all the time. So it's not something that's practical, and it's also not energetically more practical than just building a jet engine, for example.
So first of all, where do you get 1,000,000 volts from in your home shack?
You need a science fiction like energy source. You can easily transform energy from a wall socket to 1,000,000 volts. If you build a small thing, that's not a problem. But if you want to build that at scale to make a spaceship hover, you would need an insane energy source. And then we're back at antimatter. So if you're talking about already. If you're thinking in science fiction term already, why not just build a normal jet engine? So if you have a jet engine, what you normally do is you suck in air in the front, you compress it, then you inject, in the normal case, kerosene, burn it, and it comes out faster and hotter. And instead of that, you can also take in air from the front, compress it, inject antimatter, and you get an enormously more efficient combustion. And that works the same way. And that would even look like what you have in science fiction, because it would be glow bluing from the Cherenkov radiation, and you would have all the properties of that. It would also be quite lethal to stand under it, so don't do that. But it would be very possible. Then, of course, you're again coming to the technical issue of how do you store antimatter and how do you produce antimatter in the first place. But that would give you all the features of the spacecraft engines you love from science fiction.
Yeah,
and it would even then likewise work in space, where you, instead of breathing air from your environment, you just combine it with whatever other matter you have around. It could be oxygen, it could be water, it could be astronaut excrement. So you don't really care what matter you combine with antimatter. It produces thrust either way.
Do you secretly build mad scientist stuff in your Finnish forest hideout?
No, let's say no. No, I have very little real life space experience. I consider myself a theoretician. I mean, I do computer simulations, and I've not really touched a lot of space hardware. There was one example once where I was invited in the German Space Flight Center to just give my same talk again about how to fly spacecraft to some students, their introductory course. And then I got a tour of the facility, and there was the Soyuz spacecraft simulator that they used to train astronauts. And I looked at it and I thought, hey, wait a second. Even though this is all labeled in Russian, I know the function of all these buttons because I know the theory of it. I knew how to fly it. And I asked, can I fly it? They said, how would you know? And I sat down and they set up a docking thing, and I just pressed the buttons, and they were quite amazed, and I just docked it without using the Kurs radar system, but just docked it by hand. And I'm just collecting.
So you docked that spacecraft in that simulation for real? So it really worked in that simulation?
Yes. Yeah. It's I had read a lot of websites and documents about that. There is actually the astronaut training version of the Soyuz flight computer software is available for download from a somewhat dodgy seeming Russian website, which I found. And it's completely in Russian. So I asked a friend of mine, a colleague from Kazakhstan, to translate it for me. And I managed to navigate around, and I knew how to use it. And then in the simulator, I just knew what I was doing. So yeah, that's how I do. I don't build really mad scientist stuff. I just accumulate knowledge, useless knowledge in my head. And then now and then I talk about it and tell people about it.
I guess you would be the guy I would want to have on my transatlantic plane when the pilot is suffering a heart attack.
I don't know. I know how to operate a modern flight airliner's autopilot, but I don't think it would even be necessary because they can be remote controlled nowadays.
Okay. Fascinating. Urs, tell me a little about your research at the university. So you mentioned supercomputers, you mentioned your work with plasma. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the central thing that I'm working with is called Vlasiator. It's a simulation code for simulating plasma in near Earth space, and it's actually open source. If you Google for Vlasiator, it comes from the Russian name Vlasov, the Russian scientist who developed this basic equation of plasma physics. You can download it from GitHub. It's open source, and you can run it on your own machine. Except it's not really useful if you don't have 20 terabytes of memory for it. But what this thing does is it really just simulates how plasma flows around Earth. And then we set it up with some scenarios, what solar wind speed, what density, and so on, and look at where does this plasma end up? What structures does it form? Where do higher energy particles come in? Where do they precipitate in the atmosphere? And we can simulate spacecraft orbits and look at what their radiation environment is. And unfortunately, since this is a big system, we're basically simulating from the center of Earth all the way to the moon at 300 kilometer resolution. It requires the biggest computers in Europe to run that. So there are machines by companies like Cray. One big machine in Stuttgart that I've recently been running on, we've had 100,000 CPUs crunching one simulation at the same time. And so my day-to-day work is mostly cursing about computers and simulations crashing. But then you have this data set coming out of that where you can actually much better than satellite measurements see where things are flowing from where to where and what's happening with that.
I've always dreamt of playing my favorite computer game on a supercomputer. Would that make sense? Have you ever done that when people were off and sleeping and you were up during your nerd night?
Supercomputers unfortunately don't have graphics cards. No. Or if they do have graphic cards, they're for crunching and they don't have a screen attached. So it's not
the crypto people who have the graphics cards.
Yeah, and the supercomputers look very similar to a Bitcoin mining farm, I would say. It's a hall full of racks, full of hardware, and you never actually physically go there. I sit here in my log cabin and I log in through the internet and I just tell the computer, run this on 100,000 CPUs. Okay. And 4 hours later, it tells me it ran and it crashed. And so unfortunately, there's not much nice things you can interactively do with those. So it would be very nice to run your favorite 3D shooters, and instead of having one CPU, you can have one CPU per pixel on your screen, no problem. But that's unfortunately not how it goes.
Urs, if we take a look into the space industry, new space industry, what's your most favorite project, you would say, that has the most future potential?
Realistically, in terms of the speed of progress that's being done, and I know I'm now answering outside of what you were actually asking, the Chinese space program, because everybody has eyes on SpaceX and how they're advancing with their rockets, and they are doing a very great job. They're launching big masses into orbit. But the problem with that is once you have a Starship in orbit and you want to go anywhere, you need to do research on life support systems. You need to do research on habitats. You need to do research on all that. And SpaceX is currently not doing that. They're building rockets, and they're good at that. But once they have the Starship up, they will notice that they can't go to Mars with it because nobody dares go with this simplish life support system that they have on the Dragon. The Chinese are doing very, very active research on that. They have a facility in Beijing that's completely sealed, where people live in a closed cycle environment for 500 days on end, where they actually grow plants from their own excrement and eat that and generate air from it, and it works. It doesn't need any external input. And then they are also developing interesting technologies for the landers. They have the rovers roving on the backside of the moon, for example, with relay satellites at the Lagrangian point and so on. So in terms of how completely the vision is, how much they are investing in technologies that others aren't thinking of, I would actually say they are a bit ahead. This is not to say that the Western space agencies and the companies aren't also focusing on good issues there. But the ones that have it all in one box are the Chinese at the moment, I would say. Which is a little bit interesting, because then you have this whole trend, this upcoming technologies, the rockets going to space, and then you'll have basically a big industry branch just shipping stuff to low Earth orbit and not doing yet anything new. And so there will be interesting new developments suddenly popping up as soon as the launching opportunities are there.
So are you saying that we're not thinking big enough yet?
We're not thinking out of the box enough yet. We are building rockets that are working great and so on. And then what? If let's say your focus is you want to colonize Mars, so you fly to Mars, and what do you do then? What do you do next? How do you grow plants in Martian soil? What do you need even in terms of soil bacteria there? What do you need in terms of what do you need in terms of a societal structure if you want to form a colony somewhere else and so on? These things are, of course, being discussed by somebody somewhere, and there are research departments in universities, but these are not really being discussed by the new space industry at the moment. They are just focusing on the thing at hand that right now looks like
the low-hanging fruits.
Right, yeah, launching. Not even if it's not a low-hanging fruit to build the biggest rocket ever, it's still just the logical next step to advance the industry.
Absolutely.
But if you want to go beyond that, you need to consider a lot more other things.
You know what? I keep repeating myself for our listeners who have been listening to previous episodes, because there's a question that drives me almost crazy, and this is why I keep talking about it time and again and keep asking it time and again. Why aren't we understanding that the new space industry is giving us a huge opportunity for humanity to make an evolutionary step when it comes to our societal structures, to our political systems, to our understanding how to deal with resources? because we have so many things to do here on Earth, and space could be an inspiration for us. Space could be a new start. And as you were saying, we are not understanding that chance that we have here because we are reaching for the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is to go to the moon and set up shop on the moon. I mean, like, nice, but is that really the goal we should have?
My favorite pet peeve in the last 2 years, since we've had this coronavirus pandemic, is why didn't any country in the world just go ahead and say, all right, we are now going to mass produce spacesuits. It would have been very nice 2 years ago to just start mass producing spacesuits. Give every citizen a spacesuit. The virus pandemic would have been wiped out immediately if everybody breathes their own air. And then you would have a very well greased spacesuit industry. And as soon as spaceflight takes off, you would be the world market leader in producing spacesuits. This would have been something that basically every country, every industrialized nation could have decided to do, and nobody did. And I'm still annoyed by that. I would have wanted a spacesuit. So that is exactly what you mean. It would have given us the opportunity to think out that box. Maybe somebody still wants to mass produce spacesuits now. It's probably still a good idea. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. Just flying to space isn't the only thing we need to solve.
Yeah.
But there are lots of other things, lots of other practical things we can do that would even make good industry, right?
Where do you get your super nerdy space knowledge from?
There's one particular source of information that I missed talking about earlier. Because I'm in Finland, I've been using IRC, the Internet Relay Chat Network. That's has been invented here in the 80s and is still going on. And there's one particular IRC channel that's called Space in the Libera network. So hashtag space in the Libera network, where I've been hanging out for, I think, the last 22 years or so. And it's a remarkable place because it's frequented by some people from the new space industry. Sometimes astronauts are coming in there.
Really?
It was that channel where when the Cassini probe was landing, somebody at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory was actually pasting the images from the probe there before he uploaded it to the NASA's own system. So I saw them before NASA saw them through that channel. And that's where just random useless space facts come in all the time. For example, the fact that the Russians have vodka on the space station and traded with the Americans for their shrimp cocktail, because apparently the American shrimp cocktail is very delicious and the Russians bring the vodka. So that's the unofficial currency on the space station.
Can you get wasted in outer space?
I suppose.
You think
it's not an officially admitted fact by anybody,
but a scientific experiment.
But there is the story that somebody asked the ISS payload manager about whether the Russians have vodka on the space station, and she apparently strictly said no while nodding her head strongly. So it's one of these things that is not officially being talked about, but everybody seems to know. And because it's not officially the case, there's also no official science on that. Nobody knows that there is vodka on the space station, but apparently they are having nice parties in the Russian segment of the ISS. But there's nothing documented. It's unknown.
Nice.
Just like there is no official research on sex in space. There is also one case of a Canadian astronaut who flew together with another astronaut, and they later got married after the flight. They did it in secret so that NASA wouldn't know. But she is very diplomatic about it and doesn't talk about it because she's also nowadays the Governor General of Canada, Julie Payette. So she doesn't give any information away either.
We should get her on the show, I guess.
Maybe.
Now let's energize our minds. Why don't you share an espresso for the mind? That is, you pick a topic that you feel like could be an inspiration for our audience.
Okay, here's a interesting thing that I looked up. Everybody knows the first words of Neil Armstrong when he landed on the moon. I mean, he said it's a small step for man and so on, giant leap for mankind. And then Buzz Aldrin came with him as the second man on the moon. And nobody really seems to know what are the first words of Buzz Aldrin on the moon. So I looked it up. The NASA communication transcripts are available online, the radio logs. And he came down the ladder a couple of minutes after Neil Armstrong. And he looked around, and the first words that he said were, "Oh, look, it's a beautiful view around here." And I think these are just as nice words to say as the second person on a new celestial body as the first ones. And I think that deserves a little bit more recognition internationally, because sometimes it's just a beautiful view out there.
Wonderful. Urs, thank you so much for taking the time. That was super, super nerdy. And our audiences keep asking for nerd stuff, and you delivered it just fine. Thank you so much.
Sure. Anytime.
Thank you all for traveling with us. We really appreciate your loyalty and growing interest in our show. Please consider spreading the word or rating us on wherever you love listening to your favorite podcasts. Most of you are Space Watchers already, right? If not, become one. Our mothership SpaceWatch.Global has more, even t-shirts and radios and lounges and cafes and articles and lots of fun to still you craving for all things space. Happy to have you. Take care. Bye-bye.